Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Human Risk podcast. What I've got for you this time is something rather unusual. As regular listeners will know, my guests are a mixture of people who've experienced human risk, academics who've studied subjects that are relevant to it, and behavioural science practitioners who can help us understand how to mitigate or influence it. This episode is a little different because my guest this time, Eggsy, is a 22-year-old who's just graduated in film studies. She's no ordinary 22-year-old though, and recently she did something really interesting. Wherever you live, you'll be being bombarded with messages about the coronavirus and the steps the authorities want you to take to help minimise the spread of the disease. The UK, where both Eggsy and I live, is no different. What she noticed was that the official government campaigns weren't resonating with many of her friends. They were simply continuing with their daily lives in ways that were helping to spread the virus. For reasons she explains in the podcast, she was motivated to do something about that. And that something was to produce her very own video, designed specifically to target young people and convince them of the need to play their part in staying at home. Using cartoon stick people, her video explains how the virus spreads and why it's important for everyone to follow social distancing guidelines. In her words, the only thing more frustrating than the virus itself is the shocking amount of people's inability to follow basic rules and guidelines to help each other out and literally save lives. She goes on, since a lot of people are ignoring advice coming from the mouths of old men that appear to have slightly lost it, I figured there had to be a better way to get the message across. The world's most foolproof method, a colourful animation from someone that literally does not know how to animate. Eggsy released her video on social media and it went viral, in the digital sense of the word. I was sent it by a number of friends and what I saw really impressed me. Not just the fact that a 22-year-old had produced something that good, but also because of the thinking behind it. Although this is a coronavirus video, it's also a really powerful example of how behavioural science-inspired training can help to influence a target audience. Eggsy isn't a behavioural scientist, but she's intuitively grasped key B-side concepts and deployed them to really powerful effect. And that's why I wanted to get her onto the podcast, because in many respects what she's produced is a masterclass in how to think about communicating a message to a skeptical audience. If you're in compliance, risk, HR, or any other function where you need to persuade a population to change their behaviour, then there's much that you can learn from what Eggsy has to say. I really don't understand why it takes a 22-year-old to do something that should really be the job of the UK government, but I'm really glad she did, and I think what she has to say is fascinating and really insightful. If you've come to this podcast via social media link, you'll already have seen her video as I'm promoting the podcast episode with it. But if you're an existing Human Risk subscriber and haven't yet seen the video, which is called Don't Be a Silly Billy, then you might want to take a look at it before listening. You'll find a link to it in the show notes. You obviously don't need to, but you will clearly need to watch it at some point. Regular listeners will know that there isn't a strict format to discussions on this podcast. The idea there is to let in some of the magic of unpredictability and to allow serendipity to take its course. My discussion with Eggsy delivered quite a lot of that. I thought we were just going to talk about the video, but we covered a whole host more. I'll be putting together a summary of what we can learn from Eggsy's approach in the video and her other projects, which I'll share in my newsletter on social media. But for now, please enjoy a surprising and fascinating conversation powered by my curiosity and Eggsy's boundless energy and enthusiasm. So Eggsy, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Nice to be here.
It's a real pleasure to have you in very unusual circumstances, which we'll come on to. But do you want to just start by giving the audience a sense of who you are and sort of, because I think that's a relevant background to why you did what you did.
Yeah, so my name's Eggsy. I've actually just graduated in film production. But
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. First class honours, very happy. And before that, I started freelancing in the video and photography world, probably like 4 years in total. So just before uni. So I have a couple of years under my belt in terms of industry experience. And yeah, that's it. That's kind of what I work with, is just film, photography, mainly in the music industry, actually. But I like to dabble in a little bit of everything.
And so you basically decided off your own bat that you would create a coronavirus awareness video. I mean, how do you even start to think in those terms?
So the situation is actually quite a funny story. So my friend rang me at about 2 a.m, and she had just had enough of arguing with people about coronavirus. So we ended up having this like hour-long rant to each other, because we were both on the same page in the sense of we're both immunocompromised. So trying to explain to our friends that are completely healthy that, look, it's a much bigger risk than you're anticipating it to be, that just became such a kind of chore, because it felt like I was having identical conversations with people daily saying, look, don't do this. And then they'd always have the same counter argument. There was like 5 arguments they could pick from. And then I'd have the same response. And then eventually they'd either go, oh yeah, you're right. Or they'd go, nah, I'm sticking with what I'm saying. And she was in exactly the same position. So I remember we were kind of just on the phone, and I said to her, I was like, look, I'm not a doctor. I can't go out there and save people, but I can spread awareness through the one thing that I do have skills in, which is making films. However, I had never actually done any sort of animation. So it was kind of a whole new challenge where I thought, I'm going to try and save the world with spreading a bit of awareness, but I might also pick up a few new skills, which would be really cool, such as like motion graphics and animation. So that's kind of how it all formed into this one big idea, where I started planning literally the next morning and went from there.
Wow. And so you decided, so the visual format's important, right? So to get the communication message across. So you knew that you needed to do that, and then you just kind of went, okay, I don't have that skill, but I will develop that skill.
Yeah, pretty much for the video, in the sense of I genuinely find myself to be quite awkward on camera, which is why I work behind the camera. And I also realized that a lot of the existing videos that are around, when people are kind of just talking at you, it's not very interactive, and you kind of lose your audience very quickly. So I figured that I needed this video to just be stripped down to the absolute bare basics, which would be, my skill level in animation was non-existent. So stick figures was like the perfect approach, because I was like, cool, you do 3 different positions, you cut up frames in between them, and it should work. So it was the perfect balance of, I was learning a new skill, but obviously it was going to be at the very most basic level that you can start at. And it was also having this kind of simplicity to it, helped deliver the message in a much more impactful way. So it kind of all just aligned for me, I guess.
That's also, I love it when you can turn something that's a necessity into a virtue, right? You go, well, obviously it's much more fun, but I think you're right? There is something in the kind of childlike simplicity of the presentation that makes it much more endearing than it might have been if you'd, I don't know, had kind of fully formed characters. And so, okay, so you pick up this new skill, which it blows my mind already that's what you did. And then how did you go about scripting this thing? Because clearly, the impulse here is people don't get this. So whatever is coming out from the machine isn't working. It's just not resonating. And this isn't resonating. And so you go, I need to find something that doesn't do all the things that the government campaigns do. I need to find a different angle. Yeah. And so what's the thinking you went through there?
For me, it was a mix of things, actually. So I started off with basics, pulled up notes on my phone, and just listed bullet points of what seems to be the common arguments that people give. So if someone says, I'm going outside, and I say, why would you go outside? These are the first things or the most common ones that I've heard. And then I went onto my social media, and I was just scrolling through again. So every time there's some kind of tweet where, half of the people agree, half the people don't, I was kind of making notes of what are people saying. And then in order to expand the script, I looked at what people's arguments were, and I needed to have something to counter-argue that, because otherwise there's no point in the video. You're not really educating anything if you're agreeing with what they're saying. So anything that I disagreed with, but not disagreed with in the sense of opinion, but genuinely like proven in terms of stuff that either the government says or that stats are saying, I kind of took it on board myself to do the wider research. So even things like in the video, I compared the seasonal flu. That's one of the biggest arguments that people were making were, oh, but the seasonal flu kills more people. But that's not true, because if you looked at, the stats and stuff, there was so many more figures that were supporting the argument that coronavirus isn't just another flu. So yeah, the script kind of just developed of either arguments I was already aware of or what was kind of regularly coming up on social media. And then I stripped it down to kind of every sentence in the script had to be worth something. I knew that because there was a lot of information to get across anyway, the likelihood was that it was going to be a longer video. So you really risk that your audience is going to lose interest if you don't get straight to the point with each one. So yeah, that was kind of it. I think I smashed out the entire script. I've sat there for 6.5 hours in one go, which was the next day after the conversation. I already had the whole script finalized from bullet points to paragraphs and started separating where I wanted the scenes to go. So it was a very intense process, but it was very, very worthwhile and fast moving.
And I love this idea of working out what the people you're trying to get to are thinking.
Yeah.
Because all too often you see campaigns for stuff, right? And it's kind of preaching to the converted. And you go, the point of this thing is not to persuade people that already get it. The point of this is to persuade the cynics, the skeptics, the ignorant, and whatever else. Kind of go and engage with the dark side, I guess, from your perspective, to try and understand it. And then the bit I love about it is it follows their line of logic. So it's very much done from the perspective of that person.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going for.
Right, so you're thinking really carefully about your target audience.
Yeah. And
then going, what are they saying? What are they likely to say? And let's take them through a logical flow in a hope that I can jolt their thinking by, is it presenting new information or presenting a sequence of pieces? What do you sort of see as the main weapons here?
I would say it's more of presenting logical thinking, because I feel like, unfortunately, a lot of the arguments that people make, there hasn't gone enough thought into it. And the only way that I can explain that is, for example, in the video, I touch on how if 3 people that have different backgrounds, so one of them, he just decides to go to the rugby after getting infected, one of them goes to the shop where he works, and another one wanted to go out clubbing. I still had so many of people that were, my friends, that were putting on their social medias and their Instagrams and stuff, saying that they were going out clubbing and going to all their sports activities. And I think for me, it's just a case of you need to provide, not necessarily show them that they're wrong, but provide more thinking behind their existing thinking, if that makes sense. So you develop on the ideas that they already have. So in the video, the guy that works in the supermarket, Sam, the point of it is to show that obviously the entire country can't physically go into lockdown. The point isn't to stop the virus, it's to slow the spread. And I think that's one of the biggest miscommunications that the government have put out there, is they're scaring people into thinking, if you go outside, you're going to die. That's not the point. The point is, if you go outside, you're putting other people at risk, even if you're not at risk. And that's the part that we kind of need to drive home, is it might not seem real when it's in other countries, but suddenly when it starts being your grandparents or your younger siblings that have underlying conditions or that kind of thing, that drives home to a lot more people. So that's the point, is like the guy that works in the supermarket, he's classed as an essential worker. He is inevitably going to spread it. But if everyone else around him stays at home, there's only so many people he can spread it to, and it slows it down a lot. So I think that's basically just the driving force of the video, is try to see it from people's perspectives, but then give them that extra helping hand in taking the next step forward in their thinking, so they don't just kind of stop at that one barrier.
The bit that I like is about the realism of this thing. I don't mean the realism of the cartoon, but I mean the thinking behind the logic, which is to go, I'm going to pick some things that it's realistic for my target audience to be thinking about doing. Again, that comes from the fact you've researched this. But I like the fact that the supermarket guy, you admit the fact that he's going to infect some people.
Yeah.
And there's a really interesting bit of honesty and transparency around there, which goes, let me explain to you exactly what's happening here. And I'm going to give you the full picture.
Yeah.
Because often you see in other campaigns, it's binary, it's good or bad, and you're basically going, this is a bit nuanced and a bit complex. And we have to accept that we're not doing every single thing we can. And so you've leveled with people. And I find that quite interesting as well, that you kind of were prepared to be transparent around that and not pretending, if you like, that the lockdown is perfect.
Yeah, because I think, again, that's one of the things that stood out to me, was the problem with like the government messages and the official messages going around, is that it seems to be that they want to play it as like a black and white situation, either this happens or this happens, but that's not the reality of it. And I think if you actually want people to be on your side, you need to be honest about the good and the bad. So I think that was the point of the video, is not necessarily scare people like I find that a lot of the government videos try to do, which is don't go outside, you'll die. In mine, it was a lot more, do you get what I mean? Because there definitely is a consequence of it if we play it wrong, but it's also not the whole situation. It's not a case of you step outside and that's your end. But I think that is the message that you kind of have to try and spread, is that it might not be instant impact. Like, for example, the virus might not show for a certain amount of days, so you don't know you're carrying it. that's such a big thing that I wish the government would emphasize more, is not just, social distance to protect yourselves. Why? Give people that extra step of information, because that extra step is what's giving people the gap to make up excuses. And if you fill the step, there's nothing for them to make the excuses with. So that was kind of it, is get on their level and be honest. That's all you can do, because especially if you do have a very biased video, which is, we're completely fine, or we're all going to die, and there's no in between, it's very hard to get people on your side, because no one's ever going to fully agree with one side. But if you kind of go in the middle and slightly sway it more towards this is the real situation, you're likely to get a lot more people on board that agree with you.
And it's such an obvious point, but they kind of seem to have missed it. And what I find interesting about it is we had very early on, there were some messages that I think have been really, really dangerous. So we had a prime minister saying, I've been shaking hands with loads of people on a coronavirus ward, and sort of flippantly making that, who then tries to subsequently say this is very serious. And I think once you've put one message out that's just a silly little anecdote that was sort of, I think, said on the spur of the moment, I think that's really dangerous, because you can't then pivot to a message that's the opposite, which is this thing is really dangerous.
That's exactly the thing that happened. Is I personally believe that the way that we kind of messed up was that we saw what was happening in other countries. For example, Italy. The government kept saying, look, we're following science, but scientific facts were showing that we were about 2 weeks away. So that's why I'm not really sure where they were, getting this kind of data from. And I think that's where people start becoming doubtful and very hypocritical, is because, like you said, if you say one thing that's on one end of the spectrum and within 24 hours you've changed your mind as the other end, people have no reason to believe you, because you sound very doubtful of yourself. And if you sound doubtful of what you're saying, it's very hard to convince people to believe you. My aim behind the video was that every point that I was going to make had to be concrete, and I had to be confident in it. Even if some figures were just approximate, for example, fatality rates, that's because it's ever changing, and I made that clear. So I think that's one of the important things, is that with the government, if they weren't sure at the start, they should have been honest that, look, we don't really know the situation. This is how we're going to try to approach it. Instead of saying, don't worry about it, guys. We're all going to get herd immunity. We'll be absolutely cracking in 2 weeks. Like, it's no big deal. That's, like you said, that's where the danger comes in, is this kind of 180 flip on their view. And I think that's another reason why I felt like I had to do something, because at the end of the day, the government is filled with people that are from an older generation. And unfortunately, the people that are finding themselves rebellious and thinking that they don't apply to this situation is people my age. I'm 22 years old. And I think the main kind of culprits at the moment are, I'd say, 16 to 25-year-olds, because, again, the government kind of implied that younger people were unstoppable, invincible when it came to this, and only people above 80 of underlying health conditions were dying from it. And I think that kind of encouraged everyone else to think, it's fine, as people keep saying, the unfortunate quote they keep using, they were on God's doorstep anyway. And I just kind of think that when you have this older generation trying to give messages where they're being very hypocritical, I know that my generation is, I don't know if rebellious is the right word, but they do like to do things their own way. So I figured maybe if the message comes from someone that is their age and knows how to speak to them in their slang and keep it more informal, and we kind of just get to chat as we want to, maybe that would help drive the message home. I never actually expected the kind of outreach and audience that the video did get to. In my head, it was like, even if I can just convince my own friends who are getting on my nerves that stay indoors, then, that's a win for me. So, that's...
And you've learned a new skill, right? So,
exactly.
So it's kind of, so even just doing it, but so let's come on to that. So you decide to do this thing and you put it out there.
Yeah.
And of course, we'll make lots of viral puns as we go, because we can do that. So what happens then? So you just stick it up on YouTube and hope for the best, or what was your strategy there?
So I don't think I've posted on Facebook in about 4 years, but I knew that every time I did go on Facebook, that was a very big audience of people that had this whole mindset of, you're all being dramatic, blah, 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 blah. At this point, I had already been quarantining for about 2 weeks because, like I said, I have a very bad immune system. So it wasn't worth the risk. I was in quarantine, at least a week before the official lockdown. So I was like, you know what? I'll put it on Facebook. And in my caption, I put, if the video pisses you off, it's because you are Billy. And that was the kind of mindset I had, was even if I can just sway 2 or 3 people, like I said, that are my own friends, fine. But if this video can get my whole Facebook timeline to shut up, it would be bliss. So I put it on Facebook.
Right, there's a victory of sorts, right?
Literally. Yeah. I knew anything above that was a bonus. And I honestly like, I hadn't anticipated the response that it got, because within 24 hours, it was on something ridiculous like 300 shares, which for someone that hasn't posted on Facebook in 4 years, I'm surprised I even have any friends on there that still communicate with me, So when I saw that it was picking up this attention on Facebook very quickly, I was like, do you know what? I'm an avid Twitter user. That's my main social media. And I know that I have, again, an audience that are kind of my age on there. So I said, do you know what? I'll test my luck. I'll check it out there. It's a piece of work that I'm proud of at the end of the day. So why not put it out there? And again, that was a little bit slower in kind of gaining the audience. But at one point, my friend had messaged me and said, look, why don't you reply to a tweet with the video of someone that's on the same wavelength as you? And for this tweet, it happened to be Piers Morgan, who he can be quite controversial. Right. So I'm very 50-50 on his opinions, but he'd put out a tweet basically telling people stay home because people are dying. And my friend was like, look, just reply. Maybe that audience is the ones that need to see your video. So I replied, and I think I had something ridiculous like 20 or 30,000 views in it within an hour or so.
Whoa.
Yeah, it exploded. And then because I'd kind of hit the right audience with it, it was just domino effect. It just kept spreading. So going viral is a bit of a weird one. I think once you hit one or two right people and they've got the right following and then they've got the right following, it's domino effect. It just keeps going.
So it's really interesting, the parallels, right? And so it demonstrates the word viral is entirely appropriate because it's doing exactly what the real thing is doing.
So it's fast. It's hard to slow, isn't it?
Yeah. And so what happened then? So I mean, I got sent it by a friend of mine who said, you should look at this because this is, DIY, because he, and the bit I love was he had to explain, he goes, DIY effort, because I'd looked at it thinking this has been professionally produced, because it looked like it was clever and whatever else. So as soon as I found out it was private endeavor, I was like, whoa, I need to find out more, which is why I got in touch with you. But it's so it's just sort of flown off the shelf. And have you had lots of people coming back to you, or what's sort of been the response?
The feedback has been crazy. Like, so I'm someone that is very weird. I'm quite a confident person in general. I'm quite social, but my work is something that I've always been a little bit shy about. I'm lucky that I'm surrounded by very good friends that are always like, come on, put your work out. Like, it's so much better than you think. And it was kind of weird to see this massive inflow of complete strangers that had no reason to compliment my work just off their back. I had so many emails, private messages, people that were just retweeting. They were saying, look, this should be an official TV ad. This is better than what the government's putting out. You're very talented, blah, 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 blah. That was really nice. And it kind of, I don't know, it's a nice little confidence boost as well as knowing you're helping at the same time. It was just, a 2-in-1. And I have had, across social media, I've had over 200,000 views now across Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And I've only had 3 bad replies. So I think I'll take 3 people viewing it out of 200,000. Not a bad ratio for a piece of work.
That's really, well, particularly as you're using Piers Morgan as a channel, right?
That's really impressive.
but that's really interesting. And in terms of the objective to change people's minds, have you had any kind of feedback there that people have gone, I now understand in a way that I didn't before?
Yeah, so I think that's the kind of compliments that mean even more. Obviously the ones where people say, oh, it's a great video and, you're talented and stuff. That's always nice to hear. But I had one girl as well message me and she was like, I finally get why we're in quarantine. She said, it's not to stop the virus, it's to slow it down so that our hospitals can cope. And the fact that I was able to produce a piece of work that put that into someone's mind, that for me, that one person was a big enough win. If no one else understood it after that, that was incredible for me, because I realized that if you structure a piece of work properly, you can genuinely impact people and their way of thinking. So yeah, especially as a very recent graduate who hasn't really worked on many things in the real world, apart from kind of like my freelance and stuff, which again, that's a whole different audience because it's more music based and kind of social media. You just want people to click on the link and buy tickets to the tour. It was a completely different market to try and persuade people when it actually comes to life or death and, how they are actually putting other people at risk. The response has been phenomenal. I couldn't have asked for more, really. But
it's really interesting when you juxtapose those two things, right? Because when you talk about social media promotions for concerts, for example, that is a positive thing. That is, here is something fun, and I would like you to buy a ticket to have some fun. This is, here is something really shitty.
Yeah.
So there's a fundamentally different sales pitch here, because if you're, generally speaking, you're selling tickets to something, right? It's a positive, people are buying tickets to something they want to go see. Whereas this is, nobody is particularly, there'll be the odd person that's thoroughly, and there's some people that are thoroughly enjoying being stuck at home. But for the majority of people, this is an unpleasant thing, particularly as you highlight in the video, if you are used to being able to go out and have basic freedoms. And so there's a fundamentally different thing. And it's interesting that you've pivoted from a kind of positive sales pitch piece to a kind of compliance, health and safety. It's much harder to sell, right? Because it's restrictive.
Yeah. I think the difference is as well, you kind of 180 the whole thing, because when it comes to like concerts and promoting an artist, you generally speaking are aiming more at people that have either heard their work or they haven't heard their work. You promote it towards similar artists and that kind of thing. So you're targeting an established market or an established fan base. And it's just a case of trying to get those people to also bring friends and that kind of thing. Whereas with something like this, it's the complete opposite. You're trying to target the people that disagree with you, and you want to hold their attention for long enough to make them watch the whole video. So yeah, it was kind of like taking everything I know and putting it on its head and hoping that it worked. So instead of being all fun and positive, right, let's get on their level, let's use their arguments and backfire them towards them.
And I want to pick up on that bit you talked about before around the "if this pisses you off" piece.
Yeah.
Which I think is a great provocative phrase thing, right? Because you sort of go, what? So it's interesting because it plays with people's irritation factor, because they're coming into this going, somebody's trying to annoy me.
Yeah.
And that's goaded. It's clever because it's goading people in a particular way, but it's in a way, it sounds like a high risk strategy. So you've deliberately set out here and gone, I am going to tell you why you're wrong, but you've done it in a kind of nice way. And that's a skill. That's a skill in itself, right? Because normally we don't like being told that we're wrong, and we don't like being told what to do. So you've kind of, it's like double-edged sword. It's a child's worst nightmare, right? We all know that we don't like being told what to do. We don't like being told we're wrong by our parents.
Yeah, I think it is just that case of the best way to approach people like that. So, okay, let's say that this group of people that are still going out, because there are, even after the video, I'm assuming they just haven't seen it, but there are people to this day that are still going out and having barbecues, right? I think it is just a case of, you have to look at it as people that are that stubborn. The only way they're going to listen to you is if you almost convince them that you're agreeing with them only to flip it on them. Right. That's why the whole video is based on every argument that they could possibly give, which is, oh, I have to go to rugby training because I fancy it, or it's fine to have this barbecue because there's only 20 of us in my back garden and we're not, in a field with other people. I think if you lure them in with their own arguments, they almost think you're on their side, only to then get kind of punched in the face in the last second. And I think that's what you need from the video, is that if you straight away go in, because that's why the very start of the video, it says, look, Billy is healthy, Billy's 22 years old. A lot of people can associate with that. So that's why people my generation, like I said, they tend to be in like their early 20s, and most of them are healthy, or they don't know that they have underlying health conditions. So I lure them in and they think, oh, good guy, he's healthy, he's like me. And he's ill and he still goes to see his mate. So for the whole first 30 seconds or 45 seconds, the viewers think I'm on their side. They must do, because I haven't said anything about you're an arsehole, why have you gone out? I've just said, yeah, I'm going to see my mate. But then I use the graph where I show, okay, this was his decision, but this is what the actual consequence of his decision has done. And then I show the chart of how quickly infecting just 3 people on average spreads. Tenfold later, that's 59,000 people. And I think a lot of us are visual learners, and that's something that I really wanted to play on as well, is that when you have Boris Johnson stood on a kind of little podium thing giving his daily briefings, there's only so many times you can watch it, or so long that you can listen with him just saying this and this and this. It's not very engaging, and you do lose your audience very quickly if it's not already your target audience, so kind of the older generation who want to listen to what he's got to say. So I feel like it is just a case of structuring it so that you lure them in, you think, oh yeah, I'm with them, and then at that point they're so far in and it's all visual that it's all clicking that they can't really leave the video. They want to see, okay, well, this is my other argument, and then bam, you go in and you blow that one out the water as well. So the driving factor to the video was that it has to be kind of as fast paced as I can get it, and it has to just be the absolute bare bones of what I say. So don't ramble like the government knows how to do, and you have to give fair arguments. You have to show everyone's side and say, I understand what you're saying, but you're still an idiot for doing it. That's the only way to approach people like that. Just
smiling, because I'm sitting there going, that you have just made some very, very sophisticated psychological points, right? You've intuitively understood the drivers, and there's also, we could put technical terms to them if we wanted to, but there's no need, right? And I think that's really interesting. And what astonishes me is that nobody, and this is why I really wanted to talk to you, because nobody else seems to get this. There just seems to be this thing of, if we tell people and we will use logic, we'll either use logic or we'll scare the crap out of them, both of which are going to fail when you are having an emotional discussion with someone. And of course, nobody is thinking logically when they go to play rugby or go to a club. It's an emotional engagement. And so if you try and defeat emotional willpower with logic, right, we know how that plays out, right? Because I can be told not to do something. I can be told not to drink, or I can be told, I'll decide based on what I feel like rather than the logical thing. And I think it's a really interesting bit that you've picked up on, that they singularly seem to have failed to either appreciate that this is the target audience they need to go after. So if I'm being generous, I could say the government doesn't think that you're the generation that needs persuading, which is patently stupid, but let's that's logic.
That's a whole other story.
Well, logic 2 is we will just use methods that are appropriate. And I'm not even sure they are appropriate for older generations, but again, let's cut them some slack. And they've kind of missed that point. And you've just kind of neatly sidled in and just gone, no, this is how you do this.
I think that is one of the struggles, is that, like I said, I think our generation is a little bit more free in our thinking and kind of stronger in rebelling. Some people say that that's because of our upbringing, but I beg to differ, just because I'm part of the generation. But no, I do think that we're a lot more willing to express how we feel. And if we think that something isn't right, we'll carry on. And unfortunately, that applies to a situation like this, where even if the government says, look, there's a lot of people at risk, if we think, yeah, but we're not one of them, we have quite a selfish and stubborn mindset in that way. And even turning around, it's got to the point where even turning around to them and going, look, you're putting your own grandparents at risk. I've had friends that turn around and was like, yeah, but that's fine because my nan lives in England and I live in Wales. That's not the point. If it was your nan that someone else infected, you would be upset. Do you get what I mean? So I think the problem is that you had to find a different angle of engaging these people. And that's basically the only way to do it, is by showing them visual steps of how they're affecting not themselves, because like I said, so in the video, one of the guys is, he doesn't show the symptoms. So I think in that sense, you need to drive that point home and say, look, we made a mistake because originally we wanted to go for herd immunity. We also said that you were all invincible because you're under the age of 70. You need to then back it up with facts and say, actually, you could be carrying it. This is how many people you could be passing it on to. And all it takes is one billy to spread to 59,000 people. Now imagine having 10 billies. Suddenly you're on like 500,000 people, and that will just keep spreading. So I wish the government had taken a bit more of a visual approach to appeal to kind of the audience that they lost out on first, because that would be their only way to redeem themselves, would be to try and do a campaign that's more targeted at them. But even to this day, all I see is stay home, you're killing people. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. That really doesn't work.
Right, and it's because it seems utterly implausible. So firstly, it's worth preying on fear, but the second bit is it doesn't seem very realistic. And the third one is, as you say, I've already previously been told that I'm okay, right? Implicitly or explicitly, you've sent me a signal. So it's sort of, it's up against a heck of a lot that people have already got bedded into their thinking to expect them to have this sort of logic of doom deployed on them. You're right, you've got to get kind of cleverer with the psychology and get into their heads a little bit and work out where they're at. And I think that's a really interesting piece that sort of that effectively what you've just said is they lost that audience. So implicitly, there was a time where they could have got to that audience, but they failed.
Again, going back to how I think the UK was in a very fortunate position. We're not anymore, but we were in a fortunate position where the rest of the world, we basically watched what was happening, right? Because we, in my opinion, we were one of the later countries to kind of hit the lockdown. So we watched Italy, we watched Spain, the whole world watched China when it started happening over there. And I think if you have that much time to try and slow something down and you don't act, it is definitely your fault when you start to lose an audience. And I think one of the biggest mistakes was it was becoming clear, even in other countries, for example, Italy, the younger generations were having just as much impact in spreading and in fatality as the older ones. Don't get me wrong, they do generally have a higher recovery rate, but that doesn't stop them being at risk. There is no one in this world that is 100%, yes, you're going to be fine, Right. So I think they did initially have a very open window for all of us, for all generations, to try and say, look, guys, this is the situation. blah, 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 blah. But as soon as they start coming out with the hypocrisy, which is, oh, actually, no, carry on, it's just the other countries being dramatic and so on, you're kind of digging a hole that's going to be very, very, very hard to get out of further down the line, which is exactly the position we're in now. Because if they hadn't dug it as far, it would have been a lot less to try and climb out of. But the fact that they dug themselves a bloody well and now they're trying to kind of scramble out on their knees it's not helping anyone.
Right, and that's a really interesting point, actually, that we observe what was going on elsewhere. And so two things. One is we know that they could have done something earlier. And the second thing is we know that what they were doing was different to everybody else. Now, you might go, hold on a minute, what's so special about the UK? I'm going to look at what the government is doing and I'm going to go, they're mad. And that was a little bit my mentality of kind of going, it's a bit odd that we feel special in this country and we're kind of somehow going to have a magic shield that's going to deal with this thing when everywhere else, particularly, and I can get the argument that says if it's going on in Asia, because that feels like a mile away and they've had these things before. But when you get Italy, as an example, on your doorstep.
That's your next door neighbour.
Right. Yeah. With similar dynamics, you would kind of, maybe I should look at what they're doing. And we decided not to do that. So the signal that's interestingly been sent, I think, is we're not going to do what they need to do. So don't worry about this thing. So it's a little bit of a flippant piece. But you can now kind of look at it and say, it's obvious that they've had to kind of reposition themselves. And if you lost that original wave of communication and there was a vacuum that was filled with kind of broad statements, then you're right. You're clawing back against something that actually is even harder because you've got those comparators.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those situations where, like you said, you see it happening in Italy. That is very close to home. And unfortunately, I think the only reason that Britain kind of didn't clock on is, I'm unfortunately going to go as far as to say, I think it's something that's kind of ingrained in the way that British culture is, which is, for some reason, they seem to be quite stubborn in terms of following, I wouldn't say trends, but following what other people are doing. I'll give you an example. There's so many videos going around of, the Brits that are abroad and on their holidays and stuff. When Spain was going into lockdown and they carried on going to the pub for a pint and stuff, like, it's one of those things where it's like, look, if people were coming over here and doing that to our country, you would go nuts. Can you imagine, like, how angry the nation would be if we had people coming over from, I don't know, Poland and going to the pubs when we're in lockdown? They'd go nuts. But I think there's this thing about Britishness where it does seem to have a bit of stubbornness to it, which is, but it's not affecting me, so I'm going to crack on. And I think that's unfortunately what got us into this position, is just because other countries were doing stuff, it kind of seemed to be that the government had the same outlook, which is, we're going to try herd immunity. Well, it didn't seem to work for anyone else. What makes you think it's going to work for us? Right.
No, those images were like cringeworthy, just ignore the health side of it. It's just embarrassing. But moving into the health stuff, you go, what the hell? And I agree. I mean, somebody described that as British exceptionalism, and this sort of presumption that we're special. I think that's accurate. And I think that's it's a sort of interesting phrase. And there's a lot. I think there's something interesting in the language, and this I want to pick your brains on this as well. If you look at the language that's being used, it's all about war language. And so there is a subset of the population in the UK that is still living in 1945, right? That thinks Britannia rules the way, that conveniently forgets the fact that the Second World War was not won by plucky little UK fighting the rest. There was this massive thing called the USA that came in to help a little bit. And so
we're quite small in comparison. I think people need a geography lesson or just look at a world map.
But it's this. So there's this language of battle and war, and you can see it in the language around Boris Johnson. He's a fighter, which is an utter irrelevancy when you are faced against this disease. Right? It's not a matter of willpower and pushing. It's not a marathon or whatever. It's natural, and it also suggests that people that haven't have succumbed are somehow weak. So I think there's this awful language of battle, which I think is helpful to the extent of people seeing it as we all need to band together. And I think there's some helpful Second World War imagery of people helping others and let's turn factories into producing the equipment that we probably should have bought in the first place, but that's part of that. And all those, but so there's helpful side of it, but there's also really, really negative kind of vibe that comes off the back of it, which plays into this exceptionalism thing. And I think it's really unhelpful to have it viewed as one of those things, because that plays into precisely the narrative you're talking about, right? Which is It's old people fighting off this disease, and young people don't even need to bother. And it's just a really unhelpful narrative, particularly in your situation where you sit there and go, I'm at risk here. And it's got nothing to do, if I'm impacted by this thing, it's not because I'm a weak, I've just decided to give up on it, right? It's just that you have natural attributes and characteristics that make you more vulnerable. And so I don't think this battle language helps at all, because it's quite aggressive and macho. And
I completely agree. I think there is that kind of stigma surrounding it where it is, like you said, the strong versus the weak. But to put into perspective, I had debatably, like, I'd say I had the best immune system in the whole family up until about February time. And so this is the part that's a little bit ironic. I don't want to say too much about it because it's not very confirmed. But long story short, I was kind of in and out of hospital for about 4 or 5 weeks, and no one really seemed to know what was wrong with me. And I have family over in Slovakia, and I was over there kind of with a specialist after everything had died down. And they were trying to kind of backtrack on what had been wrong with me, because I'd heard about kind of coronavirus and stuff starting over in Asia and slowly spreading to Europe. I just didn't want to catch something on top of that. Turns out that they thought that I had an unidentified virus, as well as, I don't know what else, tonsillitis, glandular fever, all of this. Now, I found out probably about 2-3 days ago, I spoke to the same doctor, and they have strong reason to believe that it was coronavirus that I had. And obviously, because we had no tests for it, it's not something you could have tested. Take that lightly, because I didn't have anything tested. But the thing that caught me was that they'd originally said it was an unidentified virus. They didn't know what was wrong with me. And I had all these things going for me at once. And that's why almost instantly, when I came back to the UK, because that's when it started picking up here, I said, look, I'm going to go into quarantine, because if it was corona, 100% I have no immune system. But even if it wasn't, because of how ill I was, and it was honestly hands down the illest I've ever been. I can't even begin to put into words. Like, when I read people's accounts of it kind of starts from nothing, because mine started with just a headache. I had a headache the day before my 22nd birthday, and by day 4 I was bedbound. I couldn't eat, I couldn't see, I was going into shivers, I was going into sweats. It was horrific. And I think that's one of those things where, even if I'd been in the position where I was completely healthy, I know that there are people, maybe it's just the way I was brought up, but I know that it's not about whether I can defeat it or not, because at the end of the day, I could have passed it on to someone else. But it kind of hit home even more, and kind of made it a much more personal thing when it's my own best friends that are saying, no, but it's just a flu. And I said, hang on, I almost died 4 weeks ago, and you're trying to tell me this is just a flu. I was like, because I said to him, I said, okay, so if it had been coronavirus and if I hadn't made it, would you still have the same mindset? And that kind of seems to shut them up, because people seem to think that until it's close to home, until it's your own family, your own friends and stuff, they don't really care. But like I said, luckily I would have wanted to help even if I wasn't in that position, but it's just that little bit closer to home now that I think that I've gone through either something similar, because like I said, I was just horrendously ill, or even the actual virus.
Wow. That's a really fascinating kind of footnote, but also, I mean, it explains a lot of the drive. And of course, what's interesting about the analysis around, I need to see it close to me to know it's a danger. If you sort of look any other day, anytime a danger is close enough for you to perceive it, right, it's too late for you to do anything about it, right? I mean, if you're being chased down by a lion, then by the time you've realised he's a danger or she's a danger, it's going to be too late. They're going to come and get you. And I think this is a really, really sort of strange thing in the psyche. So you've kind of looked this thing or an equivalent in the eye and gone, don't fancy that much. So do you think you'd have done the video without that?
So knowing that I have friends that are also, at risk, and especially it's such a global thing that I try to speak out against stuff that even, that doesn't affect me. I think anyone that's in a position to, and has the privilege and the ability to, should speak out on matters that people that might not be able to. So that's something I've always had in me, is to speak out on kind of inequalities and that kind of thing. And I think because of that, in a way, I was kind of not fortunate to have gone through what I did, but obviously it gave a little bit of extra motivation. But I do believe that the video would have still come about, because the video actually inspired a kind of business that I'm working on now in quarantine, which is based on, it's called Adulthood Academy, and it's based on basically teaching people my age, so let's say 16 to 25-year-olds, everything that I believe should have been taught in school. So stuff like, your first rent, how mortgages work, how tax returns work, credit scores, your first credit card, that kind of thing. And the approach that I've taken is based on the Don't Be Silly Billy video, which is basic animations that explain things kind of
Wow.
in simplicity and in a slang that people my age understand. So it's not that you read the Gov website and, oh, this is what your credit score is. And it's like, I have no idea what's going on. So I put myself in a position where I'm lucky that I do tend to understand a lot more of like the government word and the kind of more, how do I say it, advanced word and things. I used to read a lot as a kid as well. So I think like when I read government websites and stuff, I don't find it very difficult to take that and translate it into a much more basic version, because I feel like things in life are very overcomplicated. Yeah, to be honest, I think I definitely would have still made the video or some form of video to help spread awareness, even if I hadn't been affected by it. And hopefully it proves it by the fact that I'm still now working on stuff that is just to help people. It's a completely free source, and it's going to be a bunch of videos to help people that are leaving college, leaving uni, to say, look, this is the stuff that I'm very privileged in the sense of I'm now in quarantine. I don't need to worry about putting food on the table or paying rent because I'm living with my parents. Right. So if I'm in a privileged position that I acknowledge I'm in a privileged position, I feel like I should be doing something to help those that aren't in that situation. So like I said, my outtake on it is to build something that I can provide for free to everyone else in the future. And it's kind of like a long-term project. But if there's anything else that I would be able to do that others can't, I'd love to. I think that is just something that's ingrained in me, is if you've got the privilege, use it, you know.
So there's two interesting things that occur to me. The first one is I have always joked, right, that there must have been a training course or a manual or something for being an adult that I missed, because there's loads of stuff that frankly I ought to understand, and I probably kid myself that I understand. Pensions is a really good example. That stuff is complicated as hell. Right? No matter how much they try and simplify it, it's just nebulous crap. And the tax system is another example of deliberately complex and confusing and nightmarish. And I've been through this stuff for a number of years and I'm still confused by it. So I love the fact that you're doing this, because I think it's so necessary. And I do wonder why it's not part of the education system, to be honest, because I think critical thinking, to bring us to another time, ought to be on the curriculum. We ought to teach people how to think, because if you don't think critically, you are going to get taken advantage of in all sorts of different ways, right? And that can have, as we see in this example, health disadvantages, I'll put it that way. But you're going to lose money, you're going to get ripped off, all those kinds of things. And so I think that's a brilliant idea. But then the second bit I just sort of think is, what you've raised a really interesting point, which is we as a society don't think about how we can target stuff to the audience. So I look at it from a kind of, within organizations and kind of health and safety and kind of regulations and how you get people to pay. But as a society, what the hell are we doing having a government that makes it really difficult to understand the tax system?
That's the thing that completely throws me off. I'm in a very fortunate position where everyone that I'm trying to target is currently my age. And one of the things that I really like about this idea that I came up with is that I've kind of reached out to people and said, look, what do you wish someone had taught you? And then also to my younger friends who haven't had to reach that stage yet, like, what scares you about the thought of adulting? And the perfect situation for me is that some of the suggestions that have come through, I'm completely clueless on the topic. I have no idea. But that's the perfect opportunity for me to learn, is because I'll take all this complex information that the government has given out in videos and articles and stuff, and I learn best by teaching someone what I've learned. Right. So I think making the most of my learning technique to teach others is the perfect way to go about it. And like you said, I completely understand, governments and stuff, they have to use very official and they appropriate language to look kind of put together. But the problem is that if you're just putting in a bunch of fancy words to try and look cool or put together, your people still aren't going to understand what you're saying, because there's a very small, minority of them that will understand. So I believe that education should be free anyway. The academy isn't something people are going to have to pay to learn to adult. That completely defeats the purpose. So I figured that while I've got time, because I don't know how many more weeks or months or bloody years at this point I'm going to be stuck in this room for, I might as well work on myself, because I'll be learning so much more about adulting that I don't know yet. I'll be helping others because I'll be creating a free source for people to make the most of. And again, I'm picking up new skills. I started learning proper animation software maybe 2 days ago. Oh, it's been amazing. I'm up until 6 a.m. every day just figuring out how to animate these characters and stuff. So it's unfortunate that why quarantine has come about, the circumstances. But for me personally, it's me helps creatively and kind of with what I want to achieve, and which is just kind of helping people and educating people in that sense.
And I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a whole load of stories about previous quarantines and what that's done in terms of creativity. So Shakespeare's one example of someone that produced some of his best plays in quarantine. And there's a whole load of scientific discoveries that are not related to the reasons for the quarantine. And so I think there's something interesting about sort of being forced into a situation where you could spend the whole time watching Netflix, and there is some value to be had there from time to time, right? But you could also use it to develop some new stuff. And I think I've seen some really hideous things that sort of suggest if you don't learn a million new skills and lose loads of weight, then that you're useless, right? And I kind of go, there are some people who've got other shit to worry about. But I think if you can, I think this is a brilliant example of sort of how to respond to the situation and go, okay, but it is what it is. I'm going to take some creative benefits from that and develop it. And you've just beautifully crushed that lazy argument that is wheeled out time and time again, like young people nowadays, and then insert whatever insult you want. And of course, there's exactly, I find fascinating about it because you get, sure, if I want to go and pick someone that's an idiot, I can go and find that person. I probably wouldn't have to drive too far from where I am in central London to find some young person doing something stupid. not even particularly challenging, but that becomes the lazy narrative. And I love what you've just described there, right? Is a really positive sense of engagement. It's a societal piece. And I think that's if there's one thing I want listeners to take away from this is this narrative of young people are, entitled, lazy, whatever you want to call it. I think you've just killed that in one fell swoop. So if we've done it now,
thank you so much.
Because the way you talk about it, right, it's just, well, obviously I do that. And I think for people that isn't, that of all ages, that is not a natural conclusion. So I think you have something very special there that you're energizing in the right way.
Thank you very much.
It's made me think about myself and kind of go, what am I doing that is going to take me further in this period of time to the extent I have the ability? So that is, I think, an awesome note on which to end it. I'm going to get from you details of all these things. We'll put that in the show note. But I guess final question is, where next after this? If the government knocked on your door and said, can you help us produce the next round of videos? Are you up for that?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, anything that helps people, I'm down for. I think, like, kind of off the back of what you said, I am in a very privileged position, and I know there are people out there that have much bigger things to worry about in quarantine. I think that's one thing that I do want people to take away from this as well, is even if I'm working on 50 different projects at once and stuff, you shouldn't feel a pressure to be the same, because at the end of the day, it's a world pandemic. It's not a bank holiday, like I say in my video. So
we are recording this on a bank holiday.
The irony. No, I think it's one of those things that people need to keep in mind, that at the end of the day, it's a world pandemic. It's not a bank holiday. So I think people kind of think they need to be nice to themselves as well as not take it too far in the sense of lazy. So if the biggest thing for you is making sure that you come out of this alive, or you have kids to put food on the table for, and you're achieving that every day, you're doing enough. Right. But then if you are in a position where you're privileged enough to not have to worry about, like, I don't have kids, I don't have rent to pay, I'm just chilling at my parents' house until this kind of calms down, do try and do something with it. And I think that's the kind of mindset that I'm trying to keep motivated. So I've personally been quarantining for nearly 6 weeks now. And because I'm keeping myself busy and I'm trying to push my limits and my creativity, I'm doing okay. So my kind of next step is I think every other day I'm having a new idea, and there's just not enough hours in the day to kind of keep up with them all. But no, my next step is, so I only graduated in August. So I'm still pretty fresh in that sense. And I'm still kind of networking, building up my reputation. But I've recently, since the Don't Be Silly Billy video, fallen in love more with the kind of motion graphics and animation side of video. So I'm frantically working on the Adulthood Academy. So I'm hoping to be able to launch the website and the videos by about June. So I'm putting on a strict deadline. I've cracked on with a bunch of scripts, done logos, all of that kind of thing. So Adulthood Academy is my main thing. But outside of that, I mainly do work in music industry and the theatre industry. So kind of like behind the scenes documentaries and that kind of thing. So hopefully when lockdown comes off and entertainment industries start rising again, I'll have a bit more work there. But for now, I'm making sure that there's no pressure on myself, in the sense of, if I fancy a day off, go and play with my dogs for a little bit, or say hello to my siblings, because now we actually get to see each other and we're not in different universities across the country. I think that's just my next game plan, is come out of this happy, healthy, with as many people that I know around me being in exactly the same position, supporting them, making sure we're all okay. And if I can help on a larger scale in the meantime, whether that is through more educational videos, whether that is, helping the next door neighbor or something, I think that's all I want from this, really.
Amazing. Wow. What a positive and uplifting note. if the lockdown continues, there is definitively a career for you in making safety videos and compliance videos and those kinds of things, because I think you intuitively understand stuff. And obviously, if anyone listening to this wants to be put in touch with you because they like what you've done, presume you'd be up for having a conversation with them.
Yeah, no, I'm keeping myself very busy in quarantine, but I'm 100% always free for a phone call or an email. So please get at me.
Awesome. Eggsy, thank you first so much for doing the video, because it genuinely, it's blown my mind that somebody can just do that in their bedroom, both in terms of the technical skills, but too the thinking behind it. I think it's just been amazing. And this conversation went in some incredible spaces I wasn't expecting that was also blown my mind. So thank you for putting a cheery note in an otherwise gloomy world and doing something quite phenomenal that's incredibly impressive. Thank you so much for being on the podcast as well.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
So that's it for this episode. As I mentioned at the start, I'll be putting together a summary of what I think the key lessons are from Eggsy's approach as demonstrated in her video and other work. Speaking of which, you can find details of how to see her work and connect with her, including the Don't Be a Silly Billy video, in the show notes. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. I will be back with another episode in this series very soon. In the meantime, please stay safe and thank you so much for listening.